All right, thank you, Kristof, and for coming onto this podcast. This is kind of exciting, and let's start by just kind of introducing you a bit. Let me provide a brief overview, and then you fill in the details. You are the CEO and co-founder of Pronovix. Pronovix is a company that, as I understand it, helps companies implement developer portals. One
Correct.
of the ways you often do that is through Drupal and Apogee. You've also been putting on an API, the Docs Virtual series, which seems to have had tremendous success and reach.
I did.
Yeah, do you want to add any more details to that?
That's a good sum up. so, so we um, so we are a dev portal specialist. So we only do developer portals, which I think, as far as I know, makes us unique in the world. Um, as a consultancy that's fully focused on just that. Like there's products, there's some agencies that will build you a dev portal if you ask them to, but they're used to building websites. And our claim to fame is that we decided to drop everything else and just focus on this one thing, and then go really deep on research, go deep on community, go deep on do like an award and the conference seasons and all of that stuff, just so that people can learn as much as possible, and we can build better dev portals and make our customers more successful.
Now, the topic that I want to get into today has sort of evolved a little bit. You had an earlier presentation about complexity where you talked about it at a very high level. And then I recently was listening to your latest presentation on the digital transformation. The role of developer portals in digital transformation that you recently gave in April. And I felt like you brought that much more down to earth. And the whole like COVID phenomenon has made this topic much more like relevant, I think. The whole idea that like companies have to transform digitally. In that presentation, you talked about how COVID has the recent events have prompted companies to shift from physical proximity to digital proximity almost overnight.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that shift, and how do APIs kind of factor into this ability to shift?
So I think the way I look at what's happening today with COVID is that basically we were in this. It's not super critical because that's a specific physical term, but when water is water is above boiling temperature, but because it's so pure, it's not boiling yet. I think that's how in the states that society was in before COVID. We had this transition to all these changes that digital communication have triggered in the way we work, the way we interact with people, just the zeitgeist had created this state where it was not stable. And I think what COVID did was it was a catalyst that triggered that transition, and suddenly it's like just boiling out. And I think so. People are talking about, I don't believe that these changes that are triggered by COVID that they're going to be here to stay. And I think that's it's true that just this one incident would normally not trigger that. But I think that that's not the point. I think it is the change in society that is triggering the change, and just COVID is a means for triggering that change. So in the digital proximity, what I mean with that, this is actually a term that was coined by Matthias Biel. We were having drinks in Switzerland. I've been doing this whenever I visit somebody's hometown. I try to go and have a chat about philosophizing about APIs and stuff. and he, I was talking about the shift from physical proximity to digital experience, and he's like, "Yeah, digital proximity." I was like, "Oh yes, this is the perfect way to express it." And basically what it practically means is that right now, if you have, like my sister, she works in a restaurant. She's married to the cook and the son of the owners. And they were just going on their merry business. And then COVID hits, and suddenly they needed, they need to survive and they need to change their business. So they started selling online. They started selling breakfast. They started selling lunch and a bunch of other stuff, which forced them to become digital first. And I think this is like the more immediate aspect of digital proximity, but there's also a more hidden one, which is a little bit slower to kick in, which is the ability to be in somebody else's journey. So like if somebody has a digital product or a digital interaction, that you can insert yourself into that journey and become part of that without having to have like a separate user journey. So that's more or less what that is about.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely, like, I'm sure everybody sees this need for businesses to suddenly make their goods digital, that you can order them, that you can browse them, that they can be delivered. And how do you do that if they're not in a way that can be kind of extrapolated from into some other system? Uh, you were kind of describing this landscape, and you mentioned a framework in this presentation called the Cinefin
Cinefin, yeah.
framework. You mentioned like a mountain and mountain leading to other mountains and dancing landscape. Can you talk a little bit more about this framework and how does it help us kind of understand the situation we're currently in?
So Cinefin is something that's very popular in the agile world. So I've heard people talk about presentations happening at those conferences. And basically, it's a way to classify problems according to the type, like 4 types or 5 types, really. There are simple problems, and simple problems are like a volcano. You just keep going up, you reach the top, and you're done. And it's very easy to optimize. You don't have to understand it, you just optimize. You have complicated problems, and complicated problems are like a hilly landscape. And when you're walking through the hills, and you might think that you just go up, and you go up, and it's like, oh, there's a bigger hill like 5 kilometers away. Like you go down again, go up again. It's like, oh, there's another one further down. And so in a complicated landscape is a place, or are problems where if you have an expert, they can show you the way towards the most optimal state. Now, again, it's really interesting when you have complex problems, because complex problems, they're basically a dancing landscape. So every time anybody makes a step, like anybody makes a decision or starts doing different, suddenly the whole landscape changes, and you're in a new landscape, and you have to like figure out like, okay, what do I do next? So, and I think, and then there's like chaotic problems, and that you run away. You try to somehow figure out how to make it stop. So I think the 2 drivers for digital transformation that are happening around us right now are this shift from physical proximity to digital proximity. And the second one is the shift that I think is happening from something that looks like a complicated world, or at least in human scale is a complicated world. Biologically, it's always been a complex world, but that's another story. But where on human timescales, you could kind of predict how things were, and for like 10 years you were okay, and you could have experts that knew an industry really well, and they could tell you like, do this one thing and you're going to be good. And now somehow the timescales have shifted, and we're now in this new world where things are happening so much faster, and it's so much more interdependent and interconnected that your competitor in China, or somebody that you don't even know about in China, does something, and it reverberates around the world, and it changes your business. And this is this new world means that I started. This is a new metaphor. It's kind of like, the world used to have trees, or we're coming in this today. We used to be in a world where everything were plants. Like all the businesses were plants. And there's like, I'm sitting in my spots, I'm fine, I'm growing, and I become a really big tree, and I'm happy. And now suddenly animals have evolved, and they've got this new nervous system, and they're like running around, and they're eating you all over the place. And And you know, what do you do with that? Like the only way you can deal with that is if you also involve a nervous system. And I think that's what APIs are, is this information infrastructure that acts like a nervous system to help us to react much faster to what's going around us, around us, inside of us, and then also that helps us to adapt much more quickly to potential partnerships and you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, you know, it's a fascinating kind of it's a fascinating concept because I've heard of complexity for a long time and how complexity differs from complicatedness. You know, this dancing landscape. I make one move and the response has a feedback loop that then informs my next move, which then has another feedback loop that informs my next move. It's not like a straight linear thing. We can't predict it. And each step of the way kind of requires us to reevaluate our next step. Now, and I think APIs are pretty critical in this. You had another metaphor that I really liked in this presentation. You talked about looking at APIs as a toolbox.
Yes.
And part of the first, if you could unpack that, but also the reason I like this metaphor of APIs as a toolbox is because it implies that people can build things with it. When a manufacturer sells people a hammer, you know, or a tool, a Dremel or something, right? They don't always know how it's going to be used.
Yeah.
You even mentioned that, you know, we should want to be surprised by how people use our APIs. Can you talk about APIs as a toolbox and how, like, maybe we don't always know how they'll be used?
So this concept, I did a presentation at Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt just before COVID, just before the lockdowns, and I was back then. I was like still processing all of this stuff. I'm still processing it. I'm still evolving the ideas and how I talk about it. And during that presentation, I have been talking about that we need differentiated dev portals. That we can't just make this flat interface and then think that it's going to be grand. Like you know, your dev portal should be like either a high street shopping street with lots of boutique experiences for different audiences, or at least a shopping mall with different shops inside with different experiences. And Matthias Büscher from Deutsche Bank, he was like, oh, like he came back and he's an awesome guy. Yeah, he's like, oh, like I've been thinking about this, and you know, it's like a toolbox. It's like, you know, you have like different compartments, and you take them out, and then there's different tools that are grouped together. And I loved that idea because it also resonated with something that Dr. DX had been telling me before. It's yeah, anyway, the long story, but where this idea of building blocks and how APIs that work together, you need to like group them together and explain them together. So that you have tutorials about a set of APIs and and you know, that way. So that's it. It's like, if I think there's this misconception today that you can make like an API marketplace, and that's a good concept. But the problem is that when you tell that to management, they hear marketplace, they think flea market, where everybody gets the little stands and it's kind of like the same. And I think that creates this idea that, you know, if you can just make a uniform interface for all these APIs, that you're going to be grand and that you're going to get a great developer experience. And that's completely wrong. Because you have different types of audiences that need to interact with APIs. You have people that are highly technical that need to interact with APIs. We also have people that are really not technical at all, that need technical affordances to be able to build these kind of technical journeys that they need for their work. And I think that this is the shift that's happening, and that is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, this brings up a really big and topic, a topic that's difficult to kind of wrangle, this balance between constraints, like you would see in a digital marketplace where you're very like constrained about what you can do, how you can implement something, the requirements and limitations, versus on the other end, too much freedom and like, oh, here's the reference docs, build what you want, right? Kind of like to throw in another analogy, Legos. My daughter was just asking me for Legos the other day, and when you browse Lego kits, you can buy a Lego set that will allow you to build like a spaceship or a specific scene. But the fun part about Legos is, if I don't want to build that scene, I can build something else with them, right? So this balance between, oh, there is a big picture, we want you to be able to build this spaceship, but if you want to just take them all apart and build your own, like, I don't know, rover or something else, it's available. Is that balance between constraint and flexibility key to adapting in a landscape that's dancing?
I think so. And there's a book that I thought was super insightful in that. I need to look up the title, but um, basically the core concept of that book was that life is about constraints, and that it's the constraints. It's because there are constraints that you can perform work. So, for example, if you have an arm, and you take away the bone, which is a constraint for the muscle, it can't perform work. It's just like flubber. And it's because there are bones that are constraining the muscles that they can perform work. So whenever you look around, you'll see that it's not affordances are really well chosen constraints that prevent you from making mistakes. And I think this is I think this is one way that I've heard APIs explained that I thought was really interesting, was that in the SOAP era, you had this super connected, complicated mess where you had to define everything in your calls, and it's so interconnected that anything you did, you could easily make mistakes. And in the API world, we're constraining it more so that you can't make mistakes. So the key advantage is, like, even Lego. If you think about Lego, you have very specific bricks. They're very specific size. They're hyper constrained. Like they're exactly the same size of affordances that can click into each other. And it's exactly this constraint that allows you to be so creative. It's the same with creativity. If you need to write, if you need to tell a story, it's much easier to tell a story if you're constrained. It's like unintuitive, actually. But if you're asked to say, I don't know, 20 animals, it's harder than if you're asked to mention 20 mammals, for example, or something like that. So constraints help us to be more creative and productive. And
Yeah, I've definitely seen the whole constraint theme play out just on my blog. Like, I know that if people start a blog and they don't have any topic to kind of give them focus, it's actually harder to write when you don't have like a theme you're tracing. Having some constraints gives you lots more ideas in a paradoxical way. I'm trying to think of another application where this balance comes into play, and I'm thinking of like, let's say you've got like an in-app purchasing type of API that lets people make transactions to buy things. Let's say you create some app and allow people to make payments, and that sort of thing was probably designed to function in an app store under very specific requirements about how it will work. Then you have other things come along like Fortnite that says, I don't want to be in an app store. And these other games that say, I'm not giving 30% of my revenue to Apple or something. And they start just going off on their own. Now this API, if it were too highly constrained to only function within an app store, it's kind of dead in the water. But if it has some more flexibility, maybe it allows them to accept payments outside of an app store, that kind of thing. That balance seems very difficult, because how do you even know that phenomenon are going to happen, like Fortnite suddenly saying we're done with app stores?
It's I think this is partially another philosophical concept that I really love is finite and infinite games. And there's this concept in the world that, or today, from an economical perspective, we look at a world as a transactional, winners and losers, competition and stuff like that. But there's another way of looking at the world as like an infinite dance, where you're not trying to finish your interaction with someone, but you're trying to keep it going as long as you possibly can. Where instead of trying to win the game, we're trying to keep playing the game together. And I love that, because this is also how I like working with our customers, is that we try to build really long-term relationships rather than just win the deal and, on to the next one. And I think when you're in that kind of world, when there's sufficient diversity, then there can be place for all of that. There can be place for people that are working in the App Store. There's going to be place for people that are outside of it. I think you might not be able to foresee everything that will happen, but if you can create diversity, and you can maybe through your APIs actually allow for an ecosystem of people that are doing the diversity for you, then you might be able to adapt to things that you didn't even know that were going to happen. And the key is that if you look at life, like living systems, it's not that there's one winner. It's not survival of the fittest. It's survival of the sufficiently fit. And it's always a collaboration and this creative interaction where multiple players can play together and expand the markets and expand the value space together. And then, and we're constantly dancing on the dancing landscape, and, we can't, there's no solid ground. Everything keeps changing. Yeah.
This is such a different perspective than I think a lot of technical communicators have sort of been trained with. Usually we get a product, and the first thing we want to do is a task analysis to know exactly who are the users, how are they going to use it, what are the steps to actually implementing that. Give me the picture, how's this thing supposed to be used? We don't really think about like, it could be used in lots of different ways, and we don't think about like diversity of implementations. We think about simplicity. What's the most straightforward, easiest way to implement it in the way the product team designed it? So it's a totally different way of sort of thinking. I want to come to another theme you were talking about a lot in your presentation. You talked about this pitfall that many developer portals make with a spray and pray kind of strategy, where basically, as I understand it, people develop an API and they just kind of throw it onto the developer portal and walk away. And there's no kind of interdependence or relationship or larger strategy about how it's supposed to be used with other APIs. Can you just tell us, like, what is spray and pray? Why is it something to avoid?
I think spray and pray is the direct result of an API or an organization with APIs that doesn't have an API strategy. And it's very easy to be black and white. And to some extent, you have to evolve your strategy, and you have to like throw a couple of things to the wall and see what sticks. But I think there's this misconception that is being created by the API marketplace concept, or this concept of the flea market, where I can levy a tax on transactions and I'm going to get rich, which is never the case anyway. But there's this concept that has been sold to business owners. So, and what they're expecting is like, okay, we're going to do this API program. We're going to take all the APIs from the organization. We're going to put monetization on it, and then we're just going to make money. And then basically what you get is this interface where there's like lots and lots of APIs that are undifferentiated. Often naming might be a problem, and there's no real strategy about who you should be targeting with what kind of APIs. It's just basically one long washing list of things that maybe might work and maybe might not work. So I think I see quite a lot of that, and I think that to get, well, it's the first thing is to get your organization to adopt APIs, make that work. But then as a next step, you also need to think about like what is going to be the business alignment. Just your goal cannot be to have a lot of APIs. It has to be differentiating different sections of your API strategy that fulfill business goals. Like you might have a couple of API platforms that enable specific new economies or communities. You might have an ecosystem, like an internal ecosystem. You might have like very simple affordances for non-developers so that they can do things that are technically challenging and stuff like that. I think that's how I look at it.
So, this is a topic that kind of strikes near to my heart, and I haven't really figured out figured out how to solve it. But I feel like I'm in a position, and I think many tech writers are in a similar position who are working on developer portals where we support a lot of different independent autonomous teams.
Hmm.
A lot of companies these days are like giant companies with little startups everywhere, because in order to compete in this landscape that keeps shifting, you need to have small, autonomous, agile, single
Exactly.
threaded owner teams that can be quick and make decisions and execute, right? But the consequence is that then there's lack of communication. They're like cars driving without communicating with other cars, and you hope they're kind of driving towards the same direction, but sometimes they're not. Uh, eh, so this seems like a dilemma. If you want to compete, you need to have small teams, small autonomous teams. But if you do so, then you end up with spray and pray, where you don't have a larger coherent strategy where things are harmoniously fitting together from the perspective of a top down vision, which then gets us into this other part of complexity theory about like emergence.
Mhm.
I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this balance between small teams versus larger coherent strategies? And maybe those coherent strategies just emerge intelligently on their own.
So the way that we're trying to address this right now, like, and this is a new shift in the landscape that we've felt like this year that we really started seeing, is we have large players that come to us that ask, and they want like a central API marketplace where they are going to have all their APIs for discoverability and findability purposes. You also have individual teams that have their own little dev portal that could be, for the start, could be just a copy of some sort of stock microsite, but then that they can then further evolve to make it their own and to adapt it to the experience that they need for their specific audiences. So you can like target different types of audiences where you kind of like boutique experiences. And this is what I mean with the high streets with little boutique shops kind of experience, where you can, like when you go and look for APIs from company XYZ, you do find the main portal with all the APIs together. But then it points you to a bespoke experience that might be better geared towards the different kind of user journeys that you might need for a certain type of affordance. This is what we're currently working on, and this is I'm really excited about it because like we see this with large companies that need to adapt to regulatory constraints in local markets. We see some of this. We see some of this maybe in large companies where they want to build like API products and some more bespoke experiences around this. And then, yeah, I think you need to balance. You need to balance between. I think the main reason for having a central portal is discoverability and findability. So you need to make sure that all your APIs are discoverable and findable. Make sure you have one interface for all of it. But then you could also think about the content infrastructure and the information architecture to give that a little bit more freedom. Like one of our customers called it a federated approach, where you have like a federation of dev portals with like one dev portal to rule them all. Maybe even with governance systems in place and stuff like that. But then you have these smaller dev portals that can also be owned by one team, so that they can adapt faster to the local circumstances.
Huh. Um, I, I like the boutique metaphor in the mall. It's like we keep making metaphors, right? But I like
That's
that one a lot. And that again highly describes my scenario. Like our developer portal where I'm at, in order to try to like appease the different teams with their own sense of autonomy, has led us to make a lot of different microsites where they can choose their own header, footer, and they kind of control their own little space within a larger mall. Um, and as tech writers, we help different microsite teams publish. Sometimes we don't; they just publish on their own. But I think the realization now is that it's sort of a hodgepodge experience from one microsite to the next, like a mall, right? It's like, wow, you go and you see one store that's got like a complete hipster vibe, and another that's got like a modern urban vibe,
Uh-huh.
and others that are like a discount shopper vibe. Is this a bad thing to allow this diversity? I mean, the World Wide Web is just a miscellaneous grab bag of different styles. Does it work for a company, or is that bad?
I think it depends on how you approach it. I think um, if you have the right constraints
Yeah.
around this, then probably you can allow for adaptivity. I think this is the learning of complex adaptive systems, is that you need to create the system that is adapted to its environment, and then you need to trust that the system will perform properly. And like, you have to let it do its own thing, and then sometimes it will fail, sometimes it will succeed, and then it will learn from it. And it's this. The key is the learning. Like, we have one of our oldest dev portal customers. They did this fantastic transition from a pure product company to like a significant portion of their business being APIs. And they basically have different people responsible for different sections of their dev portal, like as business owners. And there's like still coherence, but there's also adaptivity and learning that is spread throughout the organization. And I think that is the key, is that you cannot. I think that as tech writers, what we need to become is an affordance that helps others to perform work, where we enable others to be more productive, rather than the ones that are doing the work and that are kind of like the gatekeeper that the information needs to flow through. And if you can set up the right constraints and experiences, then I think that's how you can adapt. And there's going to be failures. There's going to be sometimes things that are not working out well. But I think if you create one single monolithic system, I think this is again about complexity. This is what we actually see when we build one single system for an organization. And then there's different groups that have different requirements for that system. Then sometimes that means that you're building it more and more and more complex until you have this really complicated mess that just becomes hard to maintain. So it's better to try to. I think in the microservice versus monolith story, I like the idea of macroservices, which is basically, microservices. Okay, don't go overboard, because you're going to have an orchestration problem. But build microservices, which are chunks of functionality that fit together well, that are focused around a certain job. Like, it's not one single job, but it's like a couple of jobs that are related to each other, and that can evolve together, because this is also how biology does it. Our genomes, basically all our genes, every time you build a new living being, or a new living being grows, all the genes need to work together with each other. And if there's something really wrong, then it just fails, and that's a creature that will not be. And it's almost like testing that is happening live in production, but that's how biology is doing it. And I think it's that the coherence of constraints is what you're looking for. It's like you're looking for the right methods to try out a whole bunch of groups of constraints together to see which ones are going to perform the best. And And you can't centralize that, because when you centralize it, you're not going to do the same learning. And and at the same time, you need to make sure that there's a second layer of like an emergent layer on top of that is still bringing all the information together, but while still allowing for the activity on the local level.
You know, I had an experience recently where I feel like this sort of scenario really played out. We were trying to define our release process for SDKs. When a team has like a new SDK they want to push out, we realized we actually didn't have a formal process for doing it. And so we started to write out a document that would say, look, you got to push, if it's a Java file, you got to push this over to JCenter or Maven, because we don't want to be the ones managing it, and this makes it easier for developers. We thought, oh, this will work, and it kind of worked with one team, but then the others said, well, like our stuff isn't always a jar file, like it doesn't fit in that scenario. And others had like open code that would fit better in GitHub, and others were like, well, this is cost prohibitive due to the licensing for enterprises for us. We just want to have our file on an S3 bucket. And so it was like, we tried to think about, oh, let's have a top-down policy. This will be how everybody releases their SDKs, and it just falls apart without that flexibility, right? And I feel like technical writers were often caught in the middle of all these different teams trying to publish onto the developer portal. And we have to figure out, well, do we let team A do it like that, whereas team B does it like that in a different way? Do we try to federate some kind of standards? Because, at the same time, you don't want just everybody doing their own thing. You want to have consistent terms and styles, and you want to have, some kind of federated search. So it's constant sort of interplay between standards and flexibility. It's interesting space.
I think this is what life always does. It's always this creative tension between two opposing things, where you can't go to the full extreme on either of them. There's always, like, everywhere you look, this is where the chaos of life plays out. And I think this is just another repeat of that pattern that we're seeing in business. And there's like different forms of it that will survive and that will be okay and maybe even be productive. But then you have to like leave space for, I think it's often about creating space. One of the key things I've learned as a manager is that most of the time, all you need to do is create space for people to grow and to become. And I think it's something similar, like Arnaud Loret, his handle is API Handyman. He has this, he did this talk about API like governance. And because he's like the Mr. API at his company. And basically what he said was, I realized that we can't just dictate a policy, because people would come with a design that I was like, what the hell are you trying to do here? And then I said, I would have a talk with them. And then it would turn out that actually it totally makes sense. and I learned something. And I think that's I like this from a book from, anyway, I'll give you the list after the podcast. But a book about complexity and managing in complexity, where they said that dealing with change management and helping organizations to evolve in a complex environment, you have three mechanisms. You can change the container, like change the team size or team group, or like what kind of teams you have. You can create a super team or something like that. You can create meaningful interactions, like you have this transformative interactions where you are discussing with people, or you're creating conflicts almost, where people are learning through those conflicts. And then the last one was containers, transformative interactions, and meaningful differences, having diversity. and creating space for diversity. And if you change any of these three, your system will start adapting and become more adaptive. And that was a really interesting tip. I like this is Eo Young is one of the writers, and I'll look it up for you.
You know, you've read a lot in this area. I know your previous presentation that I was also mentioning was more conceptual. You had like, I don't know, 6 to 10 books or something on this topic that you've been reading into.
Yeah, that's now during COVID I'm reading a lot less, but I like being exposed to new ideas, and I'm looking for new patterns that I can then bring back to the business. It was organizational, facilitating organizational change by Edwin A. Olson and Glenda E.O. Young. It's a really, really good book. I love that one. Yeah.
Well, we've been chatting a lot about these topics, and I'll link to the presentations and other resources you've also written about this. And I just have one more question, kind of, that I'm hoping you can share. This API the Docs virtual series is one of these new things that you guys had never done before, right? Nobody had ever done a virtual series like this in the format you've done, hybrid format. And, with the online presentation followed by interactive Google Meet, followed by podcasts and recordings and so forth. How has it played out? Do you have like more viewers than at a regular one-day API the Docs conference? Or is this something that after COVID is over, it's like, yeah, we're going back to our old format?
So it's been very interesting, like, because we were really early with this. The moment, even before the lockdowns, we were like, this is changing everything. Like, pow wow, what are we going to do? And we closed the company, the office, before lockdown started. And then also, like, fairly quickly, we were like, we're not going to be able to do our conference. And then we were like, okay, what are we going to do instead? And because we were so quick with launching this, we actually saw a growth of 20% in our mailing list. 20%. This is a mailing list we've been building for 5 years now, in 1 month, which is crazy. And also, like, our the people being present, like, we normally sell out at 250 seats. Because we have, like, in the first season we had a limitation on our technology, the number of people that could attend, so we are reaching more people. I think we've been having a more meaningful impact. I think that there still is something for physical events, so I think we will. I don't know yet exactly how we're going to do it, but I imagine that maybe we'll be doing both. Because I like that this is democratizing access. Like, anybody in the world can now access the event, which is great. You don't have to have the money to fly into Europe or the US or wherever we're organizing it to be able to attend, and that's great. At the same time, the experience is different, and we're still looking for a better technology stack. Like, there's some new tools, but I don't think that the same serendipity and the same emotional connection that you get from a physical event, that you can get that from a virtual event. It's much more fleeting, and and so I think there's good in both. And again, it's about adapting. It's like, if you're quick in adapting, any problem can be a resource. Your biggest problems become your biggest resources. And it's always been like that throughout my career, and it becomes more and more like that, actually.
Well, it's definitely cool to see you guys experiment with different approaches and technologies and to see what works. I personally have been sort of watching it especially closely because I've been trying to figure out, how can I make my API workshops that I've been doing that were in person one day, something that actually works online. So I've been kind of observing and, what do I like? And it's hard. And I think, as you say, you have to experiment and adapt based on the feedback that's coming in to figure out a different strategy. And the landscape is changing. I can barely even have any confidence about planning an event 2 months into the future because I have no idea what's going to happen in 2 months. Maybe it's all back to normal. Maybe we hit that second wave and like it's 5 times worse. It's like very difficult, which it just underscores the whole like dancing landscape. Maybe dancing is too kind of a word, right? It's too 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 delight. It's too much of a nice image. It's sort of like the dancing lava or something. So
Yeah, definitely dancing lava to like today. Yeah, for sure. I think it's one thing I firmly believe in that I've seen through happen over and over again in my career is that I would have this long-standing problem that I cannot figure out how to solve. And then comes around another problem, and suddenly the solution becomes apparent for both the new problem and the old problem, and they cancel each other out. And I have this over and over and over again. So I think the key is to not to see obstacles as something that is limiting you, but as a trigger for creativity. Like how are we going to respond to this so that we can increase the value that we provide? And this is what we basically said. Is like, so how are we going to help our community to get through this thing? And two things came out of that. One was like going digital with API Docs, and then also the podcast that we started, API Resilience, which is basically about telling the stories about telling stories about teams where the business has decided to continue investing in digital and in APIs and dev portals and documentation, and so that our community has those stories that they can go to their managers with and say like, don't cut my budget because you're going to be really sorry in 5 years. And that's kind of the idea. And then and if you look for what is how can I maximize the value that I can create in the world, there's all like you need to be a bit savvy, and you can't give everything away, but normally there's always a path that guides you to your next thing. And then so I think that would be the what would digital workshops enable you to do that you otherwise can't do. Like I listened to a podcast from a couple of sales guys, and they basically started a virtual event where they had a lot more people attending at a lot lower ticket rates. But they could afford it because it was just, you didn't have to go physical. There was a bunch of things that were different because of which it became possible. So I think that would be my advice to deal with that problem.
That's a good perspective to have, right? Instead of seeing the challenges as like roadblocks and obstacles, opportunities to like do things in a new way or different way, or what can we do differently? As you said, what can we do differently in this new medium that we couldn't do in the past? How can we exploit it for a better result?
It's also like everybody is getting those roadblocks. If you're the first to adapt, you're way ahead of the game. So if you're so every obstacle literally is an opportunity to grow your business and to become stronger. Actually, life thrives from obstacles. It's our long history of obstacles that has brought us where we are today. Yeah.
One other interesting thing is that given that everybody else has basically canceled their event, whereas you went forward, it's like suddenly everybody had attention for your event, right? It's everything else is canceled, but hey, here's API the docs and I got nothing else to do. So it's like a perfect opportunity.
It's flipped again now. Like now there's so much events that it's changing again. So our next move is we're going to be more focused still. Like we're thinking about topic XYZ in market ABC or something like that, so that we have like hyper-focused events that are really relevant for one or two audiences to to keep people, that if at least they come for one of the occasions, if they
Yeah.
don't have the time or the energy to be there for all of them. Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, is there any topics you wanted to cover that we didn't, or did we cover everything?
I still want to do a shout out for Cristiano Betta, because I call that Dr. DX, and that's Cristiano Betta. And to Robin Meissner at Cristiano Betta works at Box. He's a DevRel guy. He's awesome. He's got some interesting ideas around developer experience and friction. The friction law comes from him. And Robin Meissner, who works at TUI, who gave me this analogy of APIs as like soap, but things that don't let you fail, that limit you from making failures. I want to attribute those to. Otherwise, I think, but that's a whole other podcast. I got another topic.
Well, I know you probably, and just so listeners know, like all these questions I'm asking Kristof, I didn't give him any of these questions ahead of time. We had a whole other sort of previous script, and I was just like, I just kind of threw that out the window and went with this other direction. So like you're able to speak on a lot of different topics extemporaneously without much preparation, because you're such a deep reader and thinker. So that's definitely a good thing. Kristof, how do people find and reach you? Like, if they want to follow you on Twitter, or if they want to just like know more about anything Pronovix or API the docs, where should they go?
So I'm Kristof van Tomme on Twitter. So Kristof is my first name, and Van Tomme is my family name, and it's a Dutch name, double M-E. Our company Pronovix, you pronounce it perfectly, which is a wonder, because most people just completely mangle it. So if you go to pronovix.com, you can find more about our business and the work we do in DevPortal space. And then API the Docs is at apithedocs.org, and the DevPortal Awards is at devportalawards.org also. So have a look at those, and they're interconnected in the landscape. And yeah, if anybody wants to have a chat about any of these subjects, I'm always game. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show or having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was fun. It was a really good chat.